Imagine a peaceful day in the park that takes a dark turn when a respected police captain and his wife become targets of abuse by one of their own. What begins as a routine encounter spirals into a fight for justice that shakes an entire precinct. How far will they go to expose the truth? And can one couple's courage spark a wave of change? It was a clear, sunny afternoon when Lana Mitchell decided to take a break from her usual routine. She had spent the past few weeks managing hectic projects at work, and this rare moment of peace was her chance to recharge. She strolled to Crestwood Park, her favorite place in the city, and found a secluded bench under a towering oak tree, away from the main trail. Lana took a deep breath, letting her shoulders relax as she closed her eyes, savoring the quiet. The sound of birds chirping, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the distant laughter of children all felt like balm to her mind. It wasn't often that she could find such solitude in a busy city, and she welcomed it wholeheartedly. However, her peace was interrupted by the sharp sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel. She opened her eyes to see a tall, uniformed man walking toward her. She tensed, recognizing the uniform of a police officer, but she tried to keep her calm. The man stopped a few feet away and gave her a once-over, his gaze lingering just a bit too long. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped and authoritative. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Surprised by his tone, Lana offered a polite smile. "Just enjoying the park, officer?" "Reese," he supplied, not returning her smile. His eyes narrowed, looking her up and down. "Haven't seen you around here before. Do you live nearby?" Lana's instinct to stay polite kicked in, though something in Officer Reese's demeanor unsettled her. "Yes, I come here often. Is there a problem?" Reese crossed his arms, his stance rigid. "Just doing my job. We get all sorts of people hanging around here, some of them not so decent. You understand." Lana frowned, feeling her skin prickle with unease. "I'm just sitting on a bench. I don't see how that's an issue." But Reese didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze hardening. "You seem awfully defensive for someone just sitting on a bench, ma'am. You sure there's nothing else going on here?" Lana felt her heart rate quicken, her discomfort turning to irritation. She was on edge, but she refused to let him intimidate her. "Officer, I think it's clear that I'm just minding my own business. I'd like to keep it that way." Reese let out a low chuckle, an unsettling sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Oh, I see. You're one of those types. Think you can sit here, looking all smug, like you own the place." Lana clenched her jaw, keeping her voice steady. "Actually, my husband and I live nearby. He's—" Before she could finish, Reese cut her off. "A husband, huh? Is he around?" He tilted his head, his tone laced with mock curiosity. "Yes," Lana replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "In fact, he's a captain in the police force." For a moment, Reese's expression shifted, surprise flickering in his eyes. But the moment passed, and a smirk replaced it. "A police captain, you say?" He chuckled again, this time more maliciously. "Well, I don't see any captain here, do I?" Lana felt a surge of frustration. She wanted to walk away, but something about Reese's demeanor told her that wouldn't end well. "Look, I don't appreciate this kind of treatment. I've done nothing wrong." Reese's smirk vanished, replaced by a steely look of disdain. "So you think you're too good for a little questioning, huh?" He took a step closer, invading her space. "Maybe I should check if you're carrying anything suspicious. That's within my rights, after all." Lana's stomach twisted with fear, and she glanced around, hoping someone might be nearby. The park felt suddenly empty, the peaceful surroundings now a silent witness to the tension building between them. She tried to take a step back, but Reese grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. Reese's grip tightened. "I don't think you understand who's in charge here," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You're lucky I'm letting you off with just a warning. But maybe I'll have a closer look to make sure you're not hiding anything. After all, you seem pretty jumpy." Lana's pulse raced. She opened her mouth to shout for help, but before she could, Reese's face twisted in anger, his grip tightening even more. She struggled to pull free, her mind racing with fear. How had a peaceful day in the park turned into this? Just as she felt the panic overwhelm her, she saw a figure approaching in the distance. Relief washed over her as she recognized her husband, Captain Mark Mitchell, hurrying toward them. He had been nearby, taking a phone call, and noticed the interaction. "Is there a problem here?" Mark's voice cut through the tension, calm yet authoritative. Reese released Lana's arm, stepping back, though his expression remained defiant. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "I'm Captain Mark Mitchell, her husband," Mark replied, his gaze hardening as he took in Lana's distressed expression and the red marks on her arm. "And I'd like an explanation for why you're harassing my wife." Reese scoffed, his expression cocky. "Oh, so you're the captain she was talking about, huh? I figured she was bluffing." Mark's eyes narrowed. "No, she wasn't bluffing. Now, I suggest you step back and show some respect." But Reese only chuckled, his confidence barely wavering. "Respect? From me?" He shook his head. "I don't think you get it, Captain. I'm doing my job. And if you think you can pull rank on me, maybe I'll just call for some backup to straighten things out here." The threat hung heavy in the air, and Lana clutched her husband's arm, her fear reigniting as Reese reached for his radio. Mark's jaw clenched, but he knew the situation was volatile. As much as he wanted to protect Lana, he sensed that this confrontation was far from over. The tension was suffocating as Officer Reese held his radio, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Lana clutched her husband's arm, feeling a strange mix of relief and terror. She had never imagined a simple day in the park would turn into this. Without taking his eyes off Reese, Captain Mark Mitchell spoke in a low, controlled tone. "There's no need to escalate this. We can handle this like professionals. Release my wife, and we'll all go our separate ways." But Reese sneered, his confidence undeterred. "You're really not in a position to be making demands, Captain. I'll do my job however I see fit, and you, well, you're just another civilian as far as I'm concerned." Lana's stomach turned as Reese gave her a cold stare. He pressed the button on his radio and spoke sharply. "Dispatch, I need backup at Crestwood Park. We've got a disturbance involving a civilian." Mark's patience was thinning. "This is unnecessary, Officer Reese. My wife and I have done nothing wrong." But Reese only smirked, crossing his arms defiantly. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the air, and 2 squad cars pulled up to the edge of the park. Several officers stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity as they approached the scene. The first officer, Officer Davis, approached Reese with a questioning look. "What's going on here, Reese? I thought you were just on routine patrol." Reese pointed at Mark, his tone smug. "This guy here was causing trouble, acting aggressively when I tried to question him. Claims he's a captain, but I've never seen him before. Figured we could take him in, let the station sort it out." Lana's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's not true. My husband wasn't causing any trouble. Reese grabbed me without reason, and when my husband arrived to check on me, Reese escalated the situation." Davis frowned, glancing between Reese and Mark, clearly sensing something was off. But Reese's commanding tone and the presence of his fellow officers seemed to keep everyone in line. Another officer, Jenkins, looked at Mark skeptically. "Sir, if you're a captain, you should know better than to interfere with an officer on duty. You know how it is. We have procedures to follow." Mark held his hands up in a show of calm. "I understand the importance of procedure. But this officer acted inappropriately toward my wife. All I did was ask him to release her." Reese rolled his eyes, his expression smug. "See? He's trying to manipulate the situation. Typical." Davis seemed unsure, but after a tense silence, he nodded toward Mark. "Sorry, sir. We're going to have to take you in to get this sorted out. Please come quietly." Lana's heart sank. She felt powerless as she watched her husband being handcuffed, his expression remaining calm but tense. "This is absurd," she protested, her voice shaking. "He didn't do anything wrong." But her words fell on deaf ears. Reese's smug expression lingered as the officers placed Mark in the back of a squad car, ignoring her protests. "Ma'am, we'll need you to stay back," Reese said with a cruel smirk. Don't want any more disturbances, do we? As the officers drove off, Lana stood alone, feeling a mix of rage and helplessness. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her husband, a captain, a man dedicated to justice, was being taken away because of one corrupt officer's ego. Determined not to let this injustice go unchallenged, Lana knew she had to act. She reached for her phone, dialing numbers with trembling fingers. If the system wouldn't listen to her, she would make sure someone else did. Later that evening at the police station, Mark sat in a holding cell, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The humiliation of being paraded through the station as if he were a common criminal weighed heavily on him. Reese had orchestrated the entire situation, and despite his rank, Mark knew he was trapped in a web of lies spun by a single corrupt officer. The door to the holding area creaked open, and Reese sauntered in, his smirk firmly in place. "Not so high and mighty now, are you, Captain?" Mark's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You're abusing your position, Reese. This won't go unnoticed. People saw what you did." Reese chuckled, leaning casually against the cell bars. "Oh, really? And who's going to believe you? You're just another guy in cuffs now, just another loudmouth who thought he could get away with disrespecting an officer." Mark's gaze hardened. "You won't get away with this." But Reese simply shrugged, a mocking smile on his face. "Sure, Captain. Keep telling yourself that." Mark spent hours in the cell, his thoughts racing. His faith in the justice system, the very system he had served loyally, felt shaken. But he knew Lana would do everything in her power to clear his name. She was fierce, relentless when it came to defending those she loved. Outside the station, meanwhile, Lana's determination had only grown. She had managed to track down a bystander who had recorded the incident in the park. The grainy footage showed everything, from Reese's inappropriate approach to his forceful handling of her, to Mark's calm but firm response. The evidence was clear. Lana uploaded the video online, knowing it would spark outrage. Within hours, it began to spread like wildfire, accompanied by the hashtag Justice for Captain Mitchell. The community responded with shock and anger, demanding accountability for Reese's actions. News outlets picked up the story, and pressure on the precinct began to mount. The following day, as the station's chief watched the video in horror, he knew he couldn't ignore what had happened. The public outcry had become too loud to silence, and Reese's actions were exposed for the abuse of power they truly were. Inside the precinct, whispers filled the air as officers and staff exchanged anxious glances. The viral video had brought unwanted attention, and tension simmered within the walls of the station. Mark could feel the weight of stares and mutters as he was led through the building, handcuffed, by two officers. Despite his position as a captain, he had become a victim of the very system he had sworn to uphold. Mark kept his head held high, but internally, a mix of anger and frustration burned within him. He knew that Reese was counting on the thin blue line to protect him, to cover up his actions and silence any dissent. But Mark was determined to fight back, to expose the abuse he had experienced firsthand. As he was led down a corridor, he caught a glimpse of Reese smirking in the distance, leaning casually against a wall as though the situation was just another day on the job. The sight made Mark's stomach turn. How many others had fallen victim to Reese's unchecked arrogance? How many innocent people had been silenced by a system that protected power over justice? He was taken into a small holding cell, and the officers, who escorted him, closed the door without a word. Mark took a deep breath, letting his anger fuel his resolve. He couldn't let Reese get away with this, not for himself, and not for the countless others who had likely suffered in silence. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, Lana stood outside the police station, a group of supporters gathering around her. Friends, family, and community members who had seen the video on social media arrived to show their solidarity, holding signs demanding justice and accountability. Lana felt a surge of gratitude and relief, knowing she wasn't alone in this fight. The video had struck a nerve, revealing the stark reality of unchecked authority, and the public wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. A local news crew arrived, and a reporter approached Lana, microphone in hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you like to comment on the video that's been circulating? The public is outraged, and people want answers." Lana nodded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. My husband, Captain Mark Mitchell, has dedicated his life to protecting this community. He's always stood for integrity, fairness, and justice. What happened to us was an abuse of power, plain and simple. No one, no matter their position, should be above the law. We're here to demand accountability, not just for my husband, but for everyone who's ever faced this kind of injustice. Her words resonated with the crowd, and murmurs of agreement filled the air. The reporter turned to the camera, capturing the swelling movement outside the precinct as more supporters joined, holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Captain Mitchell" and "End Police Corruption." Inside the station, word of the protest outside reached the precinct's chief, who watched the video with growing horror. Chief Simmons had always prided himself on running a station built on respect and trust, but seeing the evidence of Reese's behavior left him stunned. He couldn't ignore the abuse of power, the blatant disregard for the values the precinct was meant to uphold. With a heavy sigh, he ordered that Reese be brought to his office for a formal review. Moments later, Reese strode in, his usual confidence intact, though there was a hint of irritation in his eyes. "Chief, I assume you're calling me in because of the fuss outside?" Reese began, his tone casual, as if the entire ordeal was a minor inconvenience. "Chief." Simmons didn't bother with pleasantries. "Sit down, Officer Reese." Reese's smirk faltered slightly as he took a seat. The chief's serious tone suggested that this wasn't a routine meeting. Chief Simmons folded his hands, his gaze piercing. "I've seen the video, officer, and I've read the reports coming in about your behavior. Do you have any idea of the damage you've caused, not just to Captain Mitchell, but to this precinct, to the trust we've worked so hard to build with the community?" Reese rolled his eyes, attempting to brush it off. "Chief, with all due respect, that video doesn't show the whole story. The guy was being aggressive, and I was just doing my job. You know how it is. People overreact when they see a uniform doing its job." The chief's expression darkened. "Don't patronize me, Reese. I've been in this job longer than you've been alive, and I know the difference between a necessary show of authority and an abuse of power. Your actions were unprofessional, unnecessary, and entirely out of line." Reese shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his usual defense tactics weren't working. "Look, Chief, the public doesn't know what it's like to handle confrontations. Sometimes, we need to be firm." Chief Simmons cut him off sharply. "Firm? You assaulted a captain's wife and then escalated the situation by arresting an innocent man, a captain in our own precinct. You called in backup to enforce your own ego, not the law. And now, thanks to your actions, this station's reputation is on the line." Reese's face paled as the chief's words sank in. He had counted on the system's tendency to protect its own, but he hadn't anticipated the backlash that Lana's video would create. Chief Simmons took a deep breath, his tone unwavering. "Effective immediately, you are suspended while an internal investigation takes place. Any further actions will depend on the findings, but I can assure you that this precinct will not stand by and condone abuse of power." "Dismissed." Reese stood, his bravado shattered. He left the chief's office without a word, realizing that his unchecked arrogance had finally caught up with him. Later that evening in the holding cell, Mark was finally released and escorted back to the main office. Chief Simmons greeted him with an expression of apology mixed with respect. "Captain Mitchell, I'm deeply sorry for what you and your wife experienced. Officer Reese has been suspended pending investigation, and we're taking this very seriously. You have my word on that." Mark nodded, his face serious but grateful. "Thank you, Chief. I appreciate your commitment to holding him accountable. This isn't just about me, it's about the integrity of our entire force." Chief Simmons gave him a firm nod. "We're on the same page. Abuse of power has no place here. And, Captain, if there's anything more you need to help set things right, just let me know." Mark shook the chief's hand, feeling a surge of relief. His faith in justice had been bruised but not broken. He knew the fight wasn't over, but it was a start, a necessary step toward accountability. As Mark exited the station, he was met with the sight of Lana, surrounded by friends, supporters, and journalists. The moment their eyes met, Lana's face softened, and she rushed forward, embracing him tightly. Cheers erupted from the crowd, a wave of relief washing over everyone present. Mark whispered in Lana's ear, "It's not over yet, but we're one step closer." Lana pulled back, her eyes fierce with determination. "We'll see this through, together. No one should go through what we did." Hand in hand, they walked away from the precinct, determined to ensure that this moment would lead to meaningful change. The following day, the precinct was thrust into the center of a media firestorm. News outlets across the city covered the viral video and the abuse of power it exposed, while social media continued to spread the story, adding to the outrage. The hashtag Justice for Captain Mitchell trended nationwide, with thousands demanding accountability and an end to unchecked power within law enforcement. Protests began forming outside the police station, where people from all walks of life gathered with signs reading, "End police corruption," "Accountability now," and "Justice for Lana and Mark." The community's response was fierce and unrelenting, sending a clear message that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, the pressure on Chief Simmons mounted. He had received calls from city officials, community leaders, and even former officers demanding action. The integrity of his precinct was at stake, and he knew the time for decisive action had come. In the Mitchell home at home, Mark and Lana watched the news coverage with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The support they were receiving from the community was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the isolation and helplessness they had felt just days before. Calls and messages from friends, neighbors, and even strangers poured in, each expressing outrage at what had happened and offering their support. Lana turned to Mark, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I never thought we'd have to go through something like this, but seeing the support out there, it gives me hope. People are waking up to the reality of what some officers get away with." Mark nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "This is bigger than us, Lana. If what we went through can help bring about real change, then maybe it was worth it. We need to make sure this isn't just a moment. It has to be a movement." Just then, the phone rang. Mark answered to find it was Chief Simmons. "Captain Mitchell," Simmons began, his tone respectful, "I wanted to give you an update. We've suspended Reese and launched an internal investigation. But, given the public reaction, I think it's time we consider some deeper changes." Mark's interest peaked. "What do you have in mind, Chief?" "I'd like you to lead a new initiative within the precinct," Simmons continued, "focused on accountability, transparency, and retraining our officers on the importance of respectful engagement with the community. This program could set an example for other precincts. We'll need someone who understands both sides, the challenges of police work and the importance of fairness and integrity." Mark was silent for a moment, considering the weight of the offer. He had always believed in justice and the integrity of his work, but recent events had shown him how easily those values could be compromised. This was an opportunity to make a real difference, to use his experience to foster meaningful change within the system. "I'd be honored, Chief," Mark replied, a sense of purpose solidifying within him. "Thank you for the opportunity to make this right, not just for Lana and me, but for everyone who's been affected by this." At the police station in the days that followed, Chief Simmons held a press conference to address the public outcry. Standing before a large crowd of journalists, community leaders, and supporters, he announced a series of reforms aimed at improving transparency and accountability within the precinct. "Today, we're implementing a new initiative focused on rebuilding trust within our community," he said, his voice resolute. "This program will be led by Captain Mark Mitchell, a man of integrity and dedication who has personally experienced the impact of misconduct within our force. Together, we'll work to ensure that no one, officer or civilian, is above the law." The announcement was met with applause, and questions quickly followed. Reporters asked about the specifics of the new program, as well as the consequences Reese would face. Simmons assured the crowd that the internal investigation would be thorough and that appropriate disciplinary action would be taken. Outside the precinct, the crowd of supporters cheered at the news, their faith in the justice system renewed by Simmons' commitment to change. As Mark stepped out to address the community, he was met with applause and encouragement. Standing beside him, Lana felt a surge of pride in her husband's resolve. Mark raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "Thank you all for standing with us," he began, his voice strong yet humble. "What my wife and I went through was a painful experience, but we've seen firsthand that change is possible when people come together to demand accountability. I promise to use my position to bring about that change to ensure that every officer respects the values we're sworn to uphold and treats every member of this community with the dignity they deserve." The crowd cheered, and as Mark and Lana stood hand in hand, they felt a renewed sense of hope. They had not only fought for justice, but had become symbols of resilience and courage in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, Officer Reese's consequences, the investigation into Reese's behavior moved quickly, spurred by public pressure and the overwhelming evidence against him. Interviews with other officers revealed a history of complaints about his conduct, most of which had been quietly dismissed in the past. However, this time, there would be no brushing it under the rug. The results of the investigation were damning. Reese's actions were deemed an abuse of power, and he was formally charged with misconduct, facing disciplinary measures that included a suspension without pay and a criminal investigation into his actions. The decision was announced publicly, and the precinct released a statement condemning his behavior. For Reese, the realization was a harsh one. The protection he had relied on for so long had crumbled, leaving him vulnerable to the consequences of his actions. His career was now in jeopardy, and the respect he had once commanded within the precinct had turned to contempt. A turning point for the community, the impact of the Mitchells' story reverberated beyond the precinct. Community leaders and activists seized the moment, using it to advocate for broader reforms across the city. A series of public meetings were held, inviting citizens to share their experiences with the police and voice their concerns. Inspired by the Mitchells' courage, people came forward with their stories, each one adding momentum to the movement for change. Lana and Mark attended these meetings, offering support and sharing their journey, becoming a beacon of hope for those who had long felt powerless. By the end of the month, new policies were introduced, including stricter oversight for officers with complaints against them, mandatory body cameras, and regular community engagement sessions. The Mitchells' story had sparked a transformation that was felt throughout the city. For Mark, the experience had been one of both heartbreak and redemption. He had seen the best and worst of the system he dedicated his life to, and now he had the chance to rebuild it from within. Standing beside him through it all, Lana knew that their journey was far from over. But together, they had turned their pain into purpose, using their voices to inspire change and bring justice to a community that had long been waiting for it. The weeks following Officer Reese's suspension were a whirlwind of change. Under Mark Mitchell's leadership, the precinct launched the new initiative focused on accountability, transparency, and community trust. For Mark and Lana, each step forward was a victory, not just for them, but for everyone who had felt the sting of injustice. Mark spent his days meeting with officers, community leaders, and activists, shaping a program that would rebuild the bond between the police force and the community. The program included rigorous retraining, workshops on empathy and community relations, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. Officers with prior complaints were required to attend, ensuring that no one was above the new standards. One of the first changes was the introduction of a community oversight board, a diverse group of community members who would review complaints against officers and ensure transparency in disciplinary actions. This board gave civilians a voice in the justice process, a shift that was met with both optimism and skepticism within the precinct. "Do you think it will make a difference?" an officer asked Mark during one of the training sessions. Mark looked at the young officer, his gaze steady. "If we want the community to trust us, we have to show them we're willing to listen and be held accountable. This isn't just about rules, it's about respect and responsibility." The officer nodded thoughtfully, and Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Slowly but surely, attitudes within the precinct were beginning to shift. Meanwhile, the outcome of Reese's case, the investigation into Officer Reese's actions, concluded with a series of charges for misconduct, including unlawful detainment and abuse of authority. The public's demand for justice remained strong, and Reese faced disciplinary hearings, his career in tatters. For too long, he had operated under the assumption that his badge would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, he was forced to confront the reality that the system he had relied on for protection was no longer there to save him. The case against Reese set a powerful precedent within the precinct, showing that no one was above accountability. Officers who had previously dismissed complaints against him were now reflecting on their own actions, recognizing the ripple effect of their silence. The precinct was learning, painfully, that protecting each other was no substitute for protecting justice. A year later, the community's transformation 1 year. After the incident in Crestwood Park, the precinct had transformed. Under Mark's guidance, the police station had become a model for integrity and community engagement, gaining recognition across the state. Officers were encouraged to participate in neighborhood meetings, listen to the concerns of the people they served, and work together to build a safer, fairer community. The Community Oversight Board had proven to be an effective bridge, facilitating conversations that once seemed impossible. Civilians no longer felt ignored or dismissed. They were part of the solution, ensuring that justice was both served and seen. Mark often thought back to that fateful day in the park. What had once felt like a nightmare had become a turning point in his life and career, driving him to make a difference in ways he hadn't anticipated. He knew that change was never easy, and the road ahead would have its challenges, but the progress they had made was undeniable. For Lana, the journey had been equally transformative. She had witnessed the darkest side of the system, but she had also seen its capacity for growth. The community support that had rallied behind them inspired her to start her own organization advocating for police accountability and reform, using her voice to uplift others who felt silenced. Through her efforts, she connected with families across the city, giving them a platform to share their stories and work toward positive change. A celebration of progress one evening, the precinct held a community gathering to celebrate the success of the new program and honor those who had contributed to its impact. Mark and Lana were invited to speak, and as they stood before a crowd of officers, community members, and supporters, they felt an overwhelming sense of pride and gratitude. "Tonight isn't just about what we've achieved," Mark began, his voice resonant with emotion. "It's about who we've become as a community. Together, we've turned a painful experience into an opportunity for change, proving that justice isn't a privilege, it's a right. This journey hasn't been easy, but your support has made all the difference. Thank you." Lana stepped forward, her voice calm yet powerful. "What we went through last year taught us that silence is never the answer. We cannot stand by when injustice happens, no matter where it comes from. Each of us has the power to make a difference, and I'm grateful for everyone who stood by us. Let's continue working together for a better, fairer future." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy filled with hope and resilience. The gathering was more than a celebration. It was a promise, a commitment to uphold the values of justice, integrity, and accountability that had become the cornerstone of the precinct. The legacy of courage. As the evening wound down, Mark and Lana found a quiet corner to reflect on how far they had come. They knew that their journey wasn't just about a single incident. It was about standing up for what was right and using their voices to make a difference. Hand in hand, they watched the precinct's officers mingling with community members, laughing and sharing stories. They saw people who had once viewed each other with suspicion now united by a common goal, a reminder that change was indeed possible. "What we went through was painful," Lana murmured, "but seeing how far we've come, it makes it all worth it." Mark nodded, his heart full of gratitude. "We took a stand, and it made all the difference. We turned our pain into purpose, and I think Tommy would be proud." The mention of their late son brought a bittersweet smile to Lana's face. She squeezed Mark's hand, knowing that Tommy's memory had been a source of strength throughout their journey. In many ways, their fight for justice had become a way to honor him, to ensure his legacy lived on through their actions. As they left the precinct that night, Mark and Lana knew that their work was far from over, but they were no longer alone. Together, with the support of their community, they had created a ripple effect, a wave of change that would continue to grow, ensuring that justice and integrity would forever remain at the heart of their work. For Mark and Lana, the path forward was clear. They had been tested, challenged, and broken down, but they had risen stronger than ever. Their story had inspired others, and their legacy would live on in every life they touched, a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and unwavering commitment to justice.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.